Charisma can bring you professional and financial stability, as well as respect, recognition, and status. That's why we're talking about how you can become charismatic right now. Sit back, press the subscribe button, and you'll learn the exact steps you need to take in order to become charismatic, as well as the one thing you need to stay away from at all costs if you want that charisma to shine. It feels so good to be back here at the Myth Slayer Cafe, and with me today is the one and only George Torok. George, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Scott, the short answer is that I'm known as the speech coach for executives because I help business leaders deliver the intended message for greater success and less pain for them and less pain for listeners.
I love it. Pain is something I personally like avoiding. So thank you for helping other people avoid pain. And we'll probably talk a lot about pains of all sorts today, as well as a zillion other interesting things, because we're going to share the story of one of the best Greek mythological figures that there is, in my opinion, the one and only Perseus. George, why does Perseus speak to you? Tell us a little bit about Perseus, and maybe even a little bit more about you.
Perseus isn't a full god. I guess he's what you would call a demigod because he's the son of Zeus and a human being, a human woman. So he doesn't have full god status. He doesn't have powers. What he has is bravery and thought and thinking. And he, when he has a problem, he learns what he needs to learn. He finds the tools that he needs to do the job. For example, when he sought out Medusa, the woman with the snakes in her hair, that would, if you looked at her, you'd turn to stone. So how do you kill someone you can't even look at? But he managed to do that. He did kill her, and he cut off her head. And he managed to do that without turning to stone himself. And so I see him as someone who's willing to go up against impossible odds.
I also, hearing that, can't help but think that he is someone who, at least to my eyes and ears, represents conquering a fear that can really turn anyone to stone, which is exactly what you talk about. Speaking. It's a cliche to say, and I'm sure you have the exact person who said it, that people are more afraid of speaking than they are of death, or maybe it's the second biggest fear after death. And you see people get up and attempt to present, they may be lively, dynamic, fun in real life, dominating, owning whatever room they're in, but when they're behind a podium or on a stage, suddenly it's like Medusa looked at them right in the eye, and they should be crying out for Perseus. Talk to me a little bit about that.
You're right. The fear of public speaking is often said to be the most common fear. It doesn't mean that it's our strongest fear. I mean, what could be worse than dying? I mean, who wants to die? But the problem is, and I think it is, we're only going to die once. So, we might be afraid of dying, but it's only going to happen once. But public speaking, we might have to do it again. And that thought of doing it again is scary. And I believe the scariest part is not so much public speaking, it's being judged by others. That's the real fear. When we're standing before those people, or even in a meeting room talking to people, or even it could be one-to-one, we're so afraid of being judged by others because we know that we are imperfect, and we're trying not to let everyone else know. Don't let them find out about my faults.
It's interesting that you share that line of thinking in light of the story of Perseus of all people, because there's a little bit more in Perseus's backstory that ties into what you just spoke about. Perseus, as you mentioned, was the son of a mortal woman, and this mortal woman was the daughter of a king. And basically, the king, for a number of reasons that aren't really relevant to this part of the story, didn't want this child to be raised in his household. So he took the mother of Perseus and Perseus, put him in a basket, basically, threw him in the ocean, and Perseus and his mother ended up being caught in a fisherman's net and raised on an island. That island's king was seeking all sorts of flattery and supplication from his subjects. And during a conversation that Perseus, allegedly this poor fisherman's son, was having with the king, he boasted that he would give the king anything, including the head of Medusa. And so the king was like, oh, okay, why don't you do that? And Perseus had to do it. He felt that if he didn't go and actually live up to his word, he would be perceived by everyone as a failure. He was afraid of that exact sort of judgment. Thinking through that story in light of what you said, people traditionally view fear in business and professional settings as something that limits us and holds us back. But is perhaps fear a motivator even in the public speaking setting?
Fear is a real and valuable emotion. Some silly motivational speaker tells you that fear isn't real. Well, guess what? It is real. It's as real as any other emotion. And it's not necessarily a negative emotion. Now, fear, the purpose of fear is to protect us. So in that case, it might limit us from doing something that's dangerous. Sometimes the fear is misplaced, like the fear of public speaking. What's the worst thing that's going to happen? What if everybody thinks you're an idiot? So what? You're not going to die. There's another audience. But fear, we can use it because, like all emotions, it's energy. And it's a matter of channeling the energy. People say, I ask them, well, what are the symptoms you have when you're afraid? My stomach is turning over. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Well, you're still standing there, so you must be breathing. Or I can feel my heart. Well, that's a good thing too, You want to feel your heart's supposed to keep beating. It's just that you are now more aware. You're more aware of your body because you are more you're into yourself, and you amplify your symptoms, which by itself, being aware of your body is kind of like meditating or yoga, where you become aware. It's just a matter of channeling the energy. So that fear that you see as a harm can be channeled into energy that you can express when you are speaking to others.
Which presumably kept Perseus from being apathetic and just hiding away, grabbing his mother and hopping back in that basket, tossing themselves back in the ocean so they could just disappear. He actually then was motivated to act due to a lot of these factors that you just spoke about. I have to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole here. You mentioned motivational speakers that get up there and say all of these things. And what I have in my mind, we were sharing this little, parody of a motivational speaker getting up there and saying, oh, fear, it's all just imagination. Oh, fear, da, da, da. It goes actually as to something related to both the story of Perseus and the subject matter that you speak about and that are an expert on, which is fear actually not only is very real, but ignoring it or just using platitudes to dismiss it ultimately doesn't help people. How does that relate specifically to you, George? Your podcast name, one of your branding lingos, is your intended message. Part of what I have a problem with in the motivational speaking space is that there is a lot of words and a lot of gestures and a lot of emotion brought into the room that appears to have a message, but that message is really vacuous. Just as Perseus's initial message was vacuous until he was called on it. Talk to me a little bit about how we can make sure that the messaging that we're bringing into the room is not vacuous, and to what extent really having a meaningful message is important for someone who wants to have the sort of executive presence that you help build in people.
First test is if you're a business leader and you're speaking to your team, say, if you're simply repeating other cliches, other analogies that we've heard way too many times, then you're not adding something new. And you've demonstrated that you don't have original thought. And yes, we use cliches as short forms, but when you want to deliver a message, make every word count. So look at what you're saying. I'll give you an example of one of those silly motivational messages, and you might. I've heard it from more than one motivational speaker. Have you heard the phrase "burn the boats"?
Yes, of course.
It's a silly phrase because it comes from the experience of Cortez. When Cortez sailed from Spain to Mexico, Cortez was looking for loot, for plunder. He wasn't going there to make friends with the locals. He was going there to kill and steal for them. And he stole a lot of gold and silver and jewels from the natives that were from the Aztecs in Mexico, and he slaughtered them mercifully. However, before he went into battle, after he landed, he burned his boats. And people think that that's a sign of, well, we're only going to go forward, we're not going to go back. No, he burned the boats for two reasons. One, he knew that if he left the boats there, he had to leave some men on the boats, and he didn't trust them because he thought they'd leave. Mm-hmm. So he didn't want them doing that. And two, he had no further use for the boats because he wasn't going back to Spain because he owed the king of Spain a huge sum of money that he did not intend to return. So he had no reason to go back to Spain. He's here in Mexico. He's got it great. He's got better weapons. He's got guns. They got swords. And they got gold. And he's going to take it from them. Why would he need his boat? So those people who say burn the boats don't understand the real story behind it. It's a bad analogy.
Do you feel that someone can be able to effectively publicly present if they don't have a message at all? Now, I'm going to exclude, for the sake of argument here, people that just have a sort of natural, strong speaking style. Maybe they're essentially actors pretending to be speakers. And again, I think a lot of these empty motivational speakers might fall into that category. But let's say you're in business. Let's say you're a lawyer or an accountant or a business executive wanting to speak before your chamber of commerce or some other industry group. Can you be effective as a speaker if you don't have a message?
Short answer, no. There's no point, especially in business. If you don't have a message, or you don't know what your message is, you simply think you'll stand up and, well, I'll just say whatever comes to mind. I'm a good natural. I'll just keep talking. Well, you're wasting our time, and the audience is there thinking, what's the point? When's this going to be over? Let's get to the buffet.
What if you don't know your message? Do you ever, for instance, have clients who come and work with you who are trying to build their speaking ability, they're trying to build their confidence, but they don't know, they don't have a core? What do you do with people like that?
One of the first questions that I ask my clients is, what's your purpose? Why are you speaking to these people? And here's the key question to ask yourself to help you clarify the purpose. And it's this. As a result of this speech, this presentation, this talk, what is it that you want your audience to think, feel, or do? Think, feel, or do, because your presentation is not about you speaking. You're not there to give a report. Maybe you are giving a report, but what's more important, your message is, what do you want them to think, feel, or do? Do you want them to feel that, oh, you just gave us a report on the project and it looks like he's got everything under control, so we'll approve the budget requests? What is it you want them to think, feel, or do? Is it that you want the team to adopt a new style of working together, a hybrid type environment? What do you want them to do? If you don't know what you want them to do, how are they going to figure it out?
Yeah. Although I've got to ask, with that in mind, George, going back to the original discussion topic today, fear. If you are about to stand up in front of an audience, or if you are preparing for that speech, or if you're in the middle of the speech and you're overwhelmed with fear, I can't help, and I know this will sound hardline, but I can't help but wonder if you're actually then forgetting the audience, because you're really making it all about you and not about what the audience needs. There's a narcissism, I have to say, thinking about what you're saying, that goes as to true fear of public speaking, particularly in light of some of the supposed harms that are going to come if you don't speak well, right? Like, people are going to make fun of you. So what? Hey, I always say someone has to be ridiculous. It might as well be me. Do you agree with me? And do you think that's being overly harsh on people? Does it help if that's pointed out to them? Or what are your thoughts?
I agree with you, Scott. When we are afraid of public speaking, we're focused on ourselves. And one piece of advice that I give to people is start thinking about the audience. Think about what you want them to do. Think about how they're perceiving your message. And when you focus on them, you take your focus off your inner symptoms. And now you don't notice that you've got those symptoms because you're not paying attention. But when you're focused on the symptoms, you're so self-centered that it's all about you. It's me.
Yeah.
And which makes for a lousy message, a lousy presentation. And if you sit down and say, well, I felt pretty good after that, who cares what you felt like? Is the audience doing what you want them to do? Did they get the message? It's not about how you feel. Oh, I feel really good, or I felt really bad. It's irrelevant. What is the audience thinking and doing when you're done?
Which reminds me of another part of the Perseus story that we didn't touch on earlier, right? And I think you know where I'm going with this, but it's about what happened after he killed Medusa, because that goes as to doing something for someone else. So what happened after Perseus killed Medusa is he wanted to go back home to show the king that he had the head of Medusa in his bag. And as he was flying home, he passed through Ethiopia, and he looked down and he saw, chained to a rock near the ocean, a beautiful woman crying out for help. And he could have passed her by, just gone on his way, but he felt he couldn't just let this happen. And as he looked a little closer, he saw the people of the town nearby wailing and crying, and he saw a huge sea monster coming out to eat her. It turns out that the parents of this princess had basically bragged about how beautiful the queen was, and as a way of getting back at this royal family and putting them in their place, the gods had sent this sea monster to come and eat this princess, Andromeda. Perseus was able to stop this travesty from happening by pulling out Medusa's head, showing it to the sea monster. It immediately turned to stone and sank to the bottom of the ocean. So once Perseus had overcome his fear and used his wits to be able to conquer this dreaded thing that he presumably never would have imagined that he could do, he was able to utilize his skills in the service of others. You're saying that the ability to be an effective communicator and move forward with a strong message is something that ultimately is tied into making sure that your message isn't just about you. But what if the whole point of your conversation is to sell you? Let's say you're in a job interview, or you are doing some sort of presentation that relates to your personal brand. What would you say about navigating those waters in those circumstances so you don't end up coming off like a selfish sea monster?
First point is, even when you're talking about, you think you're selling you, whether it's for a job or service, is to watch and edit the number of times you use the word I versus the word you. Ideally, if I'm speaking to you, Scott, then I will talk about you and what this means to you, how you're going to benefit from us working together, how this is going to look good for you, and I'm simply part of the process. Watch that use of I versus you. I received so here's an example, and as you know, I'm especially sensitive to the words that people misuse. I received an email from a person who wanted to be a guest on my podcast. They had three short paragraphs, or three short paragraphs. Each one started with the word I. I am was the first one. I have. I do. I wrote back to the person and I said, "Oh, I see it's all about you."
Whoa! What did they say? Did they respond to?
Oh yes. Now here's the real revealing moment. They responded in anger, and they said, they insult. I forget the words now. They insulted me. The person insulted me. Said that, there's something wrong. I forget the phrase they used. It was quite insulting, and they talked about how they have done this for this community, and they did this, and again, they never said anything about me. They wanted to be a guest on my podcast. They never mentioned me or my listeners or even the name of my podcast. It was all me.
I'm kind of dumbfounded. I don't know what's more dumbfounding, the fact that they just sent that out, or that you had the balls to send that sort of responsive message.
And Scott, here's another example of the silly misuse of the word I. I attended a networking event where a number of people got a chance to stand up and introduce themselves to the group. And they had 2 minutes. And the typical message went something like this: my name is, I am, we do. Who cares?
Yeah,
you just wasted the first 10 seconds of your 2 minutes, and you talked about you, as opposed to talking about me, as opposed to talking about, okay, what problems can you solve for me that's going to make me listen to what you do? But and too many people, here's another mistake they make at these networking events. The first thing they say is their name. Well, first of all, we don't hear your name because we haven't attuned to your voice yet. And if it's the first words you say, we don't, one, we're not interested yet, because we're not interested in you unless you look spectacular.
Right, then we're always interested.
Yeah. Who is that? Wow.
Right.
But yeah, so instead of starting with your name, start with something of interest to the audience. Maybe it's a question. Maybe it's a promise. Maybe it's a problem. Have you ever had the problem where, here's one that I could use. Have you ever had the problem where you're sitting in a presentation and you're wondering, when's this person going to finish and what the heck is their point? Well, I save you from those things. Now, if I started my presentation, my self-introduction with that, now people might be interested to hear my name. But if you, at the beginning, they don't care what your name is, they forget it.
Yeah. Not only that, but they forget what you do too. At least I do in networking and any sort of group setting where a lot of people are introducing themselves for whatever reason. It takes me sometimes up to a year to not only remember people's names, but to be able to connect that name with what they do, because you hear these sort of introductions of the exact sort that you're talking about over and over and over and over again. And unless, like you said, someone is just super energetic, super impactful, or has some over the top appearance, I'm not really paying attention. And even after one-on-ones, sometimes it takes me a few of those follow-up meetings to really wrap my mind around what that person does and connect it with them and remember their name. And heaven forbid I remember the name of the business, unless it's Pepsi or something like that. I can almost never remember that, sometimes even after years. So that is a really good point. George, I have to say, though, one of the things that's striking about this, and these tips are fantastic, you clearly are an expert in this, and that's why I brought you on, because it relates to a leadership issue that anyone that's stepping up and wants to become a leader worthy of Mount Olympus needs to be able to put their arms around. But were you always like, this person who knew it all with regards to public speaking and presentation? Did you struggle at all? I mean, does Perseus speak to you with regards to your own journey in any way?
I think so. The answer is no. I wasn't a natural. I was a shy student, and I am an introvert. I still am an introvert. That hasn't changed. And I define introvert versus extrovert based on where you get your energy. So I can go into a room, I can do the networking thing, I do it well, I know the techniques, I can stand on stage, deliver a speech, I enjoy the moment. However, after it's done, I'm drained. And I need to go somewhere and be alone to get recharged. Some people get charged. They get energy by being on stage. I don't. That drains me. I enjoy it. It's thrilling, and it drains me. I was a shy kid. In the first 5 years of school, I lived in 3 different cities and went to 6 different schools.
Really?
So I was always, I was trying to fit in. I was trying to make friends, and I was this shy kid. And so it was hard, and it was painful. And so it took me a long time to break out of that. I think when I got to high school, maybe it was the hormones. I didn't want to be this shy kid in the corner. I wanted people to notice me, especially wanted the girls to notice me, to talk to me. And so I think I started becoming a joker, making jokes, making funny, and pushing myself, even though I was afraid while I was doing it. And I wanted to be popular. So I figured the way to do that was to become president of the school council, because I saw that, everybody knows who the president is, and we get to see them. They speak in front. And the way to become president you would deliver a terrific speech to the school assembly. And I thought, well, I could do that. Sure, I'll do that. So I created this fabulous speech. It had humor, it had stories, it spoke to them, it spoke to real needs, not frivolous, silly things. And we would end the speech with everyone standing and singing the school song. Now, I was in the high school band, so I could arrange to get all those people, to help me out. It was a winning speech. And it never happened, because it stayed in my head. I was too afraid. I was too afraid to try it, to tell the speech. I was too afraid to stand before the audience. I was too afraid to even admit that I had the ambition to be school president. I was just too afraid. What would people think of me? Who's this guy? How dare George? Yeah. So and maybe that's something that I've reflected on, to say that I don't want to be that person anymore.
I've got to say, and I never really thought about this until you shared this backstory. When it comes to the very first times in our lives in which how we present in terms of our speaking, in terms of the package that we have out there, the message that we're putting forth. All of those sorts of things really come to head in a personal way for so many folks in the most hard-hitting fashion when they begin to date. You know, a lot of folks giving presentations in school, like giving a book report or maybe doing show and tell or something like that. Yeah, it's low stake. You know everybody. The teacher's going to give you whatever grade they will. I don't know. I just don't know a lot of people that really invested that much effort into being afraid of standing up at giving show and tell or something like that. But dating, look, I, like you, was not a self-confident young man at all. I don't think I was ever very introverted, but I nonetheless was not very self-confident. I didn't think I was attractive. I was skinny. I was geeky. I had big, gigantic glasses, much thicker than yours, but before they were cool. All of those sorts of things. And I remember talking to a therapist about this. He says, Scott, the way you get a date, someone like you, is to go out with the ugly girls. Ask them. They are so desperate that they'll take whatever they can get. And that's, by the way, why ugly people get dates all the time. All the ugly people are dating all the other ugly people. Just shoot at your own level. So he basically was advising me to not go out and slay Medusa, but to, take her out on a date. And maybe that would have been a way of not turning to stone by looking at her. I don't know. But, I sort of wonder then to what extent, speaking of Medusa and turning to stone, the fears and the insecurities of the rejection that we experience, and almost everyone does experience during those early dating years, turn us into the fearsome creature or the fearful creatures that we often are when it comes to how we present to others, and sort of buries itself within our subconscious. Do you have thoughts about that? And what are some thoughts that you have about how people can overcome those fears, whatever their origin is, outside of caring about the audience? Like, well, still, what do you do to get rid of the fear?
Our fears protect us, and they also define us in some ways. Now, we can be subject to our fears, or we can use our fears as a stepping stone, as a way to move ahead, and maybe even reflection and say, okay, back then I was afraid of, and now I've got a distance and I've got the perspective to reflect and learn from that. If I could go back in time, maybe I would handle it differently in this way. So when I see that opportunity again, I'll have a better way to respond. So I think what we need to do is, I believe what we need to do is to turn those fearful moments into a learning point instead of a point of self-flagellation. Instead of saying, oh, you failed again. Oh, you messed up again. All those. I guess my teacher was right. I guess my parents were right. Oh, you're not going to make it. Well, wait a minute. You tried, and you're still alive, and you can continue. And whether it's and you didn't turn to stone. You didn't turn to stone. You're still here, and you can build on that. So I think. See, because fear is so integral to us, to our survival, because it's embedded. Fear originates in that, what they call the amygdala, that part of the brain right at the top of the spine. That the fear keeps us alive, so it's important. And we often become overly overpowered by the fear. And we think, and we believe that we are weak because we have fear. Have you ever talked to someone who says, "Oh, I'm not afraid of that. I'm not afraid of anything"? Really? Then you must be insane, because everybody's afraid of something, and you don't have to admit it to me, but at least admit it to yourself and say, "Okay, I'm afraid of this." And we also sometimes have which seem like silly phobias. I don't like heights. It scares me, makes me nervous. If I ever go to New York City, I'm not going up the Empire State Building. Nope. And it's not because I'm afraid of some big gorilla climbing up there and grabbing me.
Speaking of mythical figures,
I've seen that happen. I know that happens, and that's a case where the gorillas, eat the people. We're not eating the gorillas,
right.
Or the dogs and cats. But so we have those phobias, and it's part of our makeup, and it doesn't make us a lesser person. So when it comes to speaking, how do you deal with that? It's not an on and or off switch. You realize, you give yourself permission that while you're speaking, you will have those moments. Now, if you're totally in fear the whole time, then we've got a bigger project. Then you got something. So what you do is you start on something. You take baby steps. You start on something, you push yourself a little bit and say, okay, that wasn't so bad. And then you push. So if you're preparing a 10-minute presentation, maybe you just start at home by working on a 1 minute. 1 minute you talking to the mirror, or maybe 1 minute or 2 minutes you talking to a couple of your friends, so that you can get used to the idea of having a few sets of eyes staring at you while you're speaking. And if you can get through 2 minutes, you can probably get to 3 minutes. You can probably get to 5, and eventually you get to 10. And then when you deliver that 10, you will have those occasional moments, and that's okay. And people don't need to know what's going on inside here or inside here. People don't need to know. And I still have those occasional moments. I've been speaking and coaching and training for well over 25 years, and occasionally there's that little fear just comes up. You're looking out in the audience, and I'm looking out there, and I'm seeing Scott sitting in the front row, and at first he's laughing and he's enjoying, and then all of a sudden he makes a grimace and he sits back and crosses his arms, and I'm thinking, Scott doesn't like me anymore. Oh, I know he doesn't like me. He disagrees with me. And maybe Scott just got a pain. Maybe Scott just remembered something he forgot to do that morning. It's got nothing to do with you, the speaker. You can't see what your audience is thinking or feeling, and you don't, and they can't see what you're thinking or feeling.
Also, I would imagine, is related to, in some cases at least, who the audience is. So you may have a generalized fear of public speaking, but after a while, let's say you're a CEO and you're comfortable enough that you can stand before your staff and feel good about talking in front of them and really not have an overwhelming fear. But then it's the board of directors, or maybe it is the CEO of another much larger company that you're attempting to pitch your own company services or products to. And then that fear comes out. I know that for me, I usually at this point don't get that nervous before speaking in front of an audience, with one exception. I'm a member of this group called National Speakers Association, and National Speakers Association is the professional organization for people who speak for a living. And whenever I stand up in front of that group and that group alone, it's very difficult, even for someone like me, to not get quite nervous. I really have to take a breath. I really am thinking about my performance while I'm delivering it. I'm self-conscious. I almost always am fighting the urge to, the minute I sit down, turn over to someone and say, okay, did I do okay? Did I do all right? Did I make a fool of myself? And is that something that you see with your own clients as well, or is that me just being weird again?
You pointed out a good point there. You are capable. I've seen your TEDx talk. I've seen your videos. You have energy. You exude confidence, and anyone watching you would think, oh, this guy's a natural. He's great. He's fabulous. And yet we all have that audience who we believe are better than us. And that's part of the problem. And I'll give you an example of how this happened to me. I hosted a radio show for 19 years, and I interviewed business leaders. And I remember the first time I interviewed a billionaire.
Oh.
And I remember sitting in the room, and the little voice in my head is saying, Georgie, this man's a billionaire. You don't belong in the same room with him. He's a George, billionaire. What are you? A nothinaire. He's a billionaire. And I remember the whole time through that interview, I was just totally nervous, and I felt intimidated, even though he did nothing to intimidate me. He was just a down-to-earth, aw-shucks guy, had a great story of his journey. And it took me a while to reflect on that, and I made this subtle change, which was significant. After that, I started to see everyone as an equal. Not better than me, not lower than me, but simply as an equal in this conversation. So in this presentation, whoever the audience is, you need to see them as equals. Even though they're judging your future, you need to speak to them as equals. And when you speak to them as equals, they will see your confidence and they will respect you. They will perceive you as an equal, as opposed to someone who is kissing up to them.
It goes as to something I talk about a lot in my own signature program, and I'm sure you work with your clients on as well, based on what you just said, which is that the statuses that we perceive, but the status differentials, I should say, that we perceive between ourselves and others is really just a toxic myth, because nothing objectively says that just because someone happens to have a lot more money, they somehow are better or smarter or this or that or anything else. It's just a common, it's something A, that we tell ourselves, and then B, that we as a society decide to reinforce, but it is sort of pulled out of wholesale. And you're right. If you can disabuse yourself of that, then nothing should prevent you from being able to just have a regular conversation. Speaking of regular conversations and feeling comfortable, this whole thread that we have been walking on for the past few minutes, I want to get back to something that you said briefly a few moments ago regarding cats and dogs and eating them. Now, people listening to this years from now may wonder what on earth we're talking about, what cats and dogs have to do with anything. This is being recorded in September of 2024, during the middle of the American presidential race, and shortly after a debate between the current United States presidential candidates, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And during that debate, ex-president Donald Trump made a statement about how Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, I think, were eating cats and dogs basically off the street. There seemed to be this pet apocalypse going on there, based on, at least as that's how I understood this very graphically described accusation, which, by the way, is completely untrue. And that is not just Scott Mason saying it. There's been a lot of fact checking and discussion about that. So that's just for those who might be listening to this later and not understand the reference. I raise it because there is something, look, I'm not going to get political here, but I will say, with regards to Donald Trump as a figure, there is to my eyes, contradiction here. And that is really, when you talk, George, about making sure that the message is about others, Donald Trump has amassed a huge following, basically only talking about himself after a certain point. I mean, he has put out some things earlier in his professional life that are bones to others, but during this particular presidential campaign, the major themes really do seem to be about Donald Trump and various grievances he's had, and various people that have slighted him, and various revenge plots he wants to have, and things that he's outraged about. And I have always attributed that to Donald Trump having, to a certain portion of the population, a massive amount of charisma. So before we get into that contradiction a little bit more, one thing that this raises is, well, there are those that I'm sure you work with who walk in this very, what I call, base camp level of public speaking preparedness, right? They're terrified, or they don't know how to do it. They don't know the fundamentals. They don't know, for instance, a lot of the rules. They don't know how to even handle a podium, let alone rules about how to give a keynote, when you can sell from the stage, when not, how you handle difficult audience questions, all of these advanced techniques. I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you take them from that base camp into an area in which they excel. And anyone who looks at your website, sees your testimonials, follows you, all of this, I think, would have a hard time disputing that what I just said is completely true. But then there are those that want to move into this extra level, charisma, that I work with people on, and I assume that you also have as part of your portfolio. What do you say to someone who wants to move beyond that? I'm a competent public speaker and a confident public speaker, but I want to be someone who has a sort of charisma that can maybe not get people to get behind a message that's all about you, but at least captivate people and develop the sort of following that a figure like Donald Trump has. I think even his detractors would admit it, definitely has been able to cultivate. How do you work with someone like that?
My best clients, Scott, are people who are already good at speaking, and they want to go to a higher level. They want to go to a finer level. They want to become more masterful. And I remember years ago, when I was in university, I studied karate I took karate lessons for a couple of years, and you'd go to the tournaments, and there would always be some demonstrations. The black belts would usually do demonstrations. And if you in karate, there's two types of activity. One, there's the actual fighting, the sparring. That's the fun. It's the fun part until you get hit.
Right.
And then the other part is what they call kata. That's the moves. It's kind of like a gymnastics routine where you're going through movements, you're punching, you're blocking, you're practicing your moves, and there are different forms and different katas that you practice as you go through the belt system. Well, I remember the first kata with the most fundamental moves, and when you're a beginner, you do it, and then you're eager to do the next one, and then you never go back to the first one. Then you want the next one because you want to demonstrate, when you're practicing in the dojo, you want to demonstrate that you're working on the next highest level kata. And I remember at this one tournament, a black belt stood up there, and he performed the first kata. And my immediate thought was, that's beneath him. But no, it wasn't. He did it so well, and he explained the meaning of every movement as he went through. And after that, I realized that I needed to work on my first kata. I needed to practice that first routine. And that reminded me that just when we think we're really good, we need to go back to the fundamentals. We need to, because we've forgotten the fundamentals. We think that that's beyond us because we've developed our own style, and which could be good. However, do you remember the fundamentals, and are you practicing them? And yes, and so I tell people to go back to the fundamentals. For example, when it comes to public speaking, doesn't matter what level you're at, the fundamentals are speak to the interest of your audience. Use pauses to allow them to think about what you just said. And use questions to engage their mind. Even if it's a rhetorical question, you pose the question, it engages them. So if you say, and what does that mean to you? And how will this problem be solved? What are the options that we have? And then you answer the question. Well, you pose the question. It's a terrific way of engaging the audience. But these are fundamentals that everyone can go back to and revisit and see, am I still doing this in my presentation?
That is really true. I know it from personal experience. You get a certain level of confidence. You step into who and what you are. As you said, you know your style. And that arrogance, it can be the humiliation that you thought that you had developed a skill level to put you beyond, that reminds you that those fundamentals are something you should have been studying and being on top of all along. They never, ever go away, and especially that stuff about it being about you. If I'm working with you, and keep it real with me, George, and say, let's not use Donald Trump necessarily as an example, though again, I do think he is an example, but let's maybe talk about someone like Les Brown or Tony Robbins or I don't know, Steve Jobs. I want to be that max level speaker that really can stand up on the biggest stage that there is and electrify this world. I always argue to people that all of this really can be taught and practiced. Now, you may not be the best speaker in the world. There's always a better speaker than you, or than me at least. But right, like to hit the absolute top level of what's possible for you, which is really what's almost the top level for anyone if you hit your own top level. Do you think that there's this mystical, magical part to it, or do you think that that is all something that can be effectively taught and practiced?
I believe that it all can be taught, it all can be learned, it all can be acquired. And it's not about being in pursuit of this gold medal, best speaker in the world, best speaker of all time. I don't think there's such a thing. There are different speakers, different people who speak differently, who are exceptional for their style and what they do. And when they become totally comfortable with themselves, Tony Robbins, totally, certainly a shining example and an inspiration for many people. Now, I don't like his style. I think it's over the top. I think. Now, because I work with business people, and a business leader, a company president's not going to speak like Tony Robbins. Steve Jobs, on the other hand, is a better example for business leaders. What he demonstrates is a number of techniques. One, he is totally comfortable with himself because he doesn't care what people think. He didn't care what people's opinion of him. He's got a message to deliver, and he knows it's valuable to his audience. He doesn't give them BS. He gives them value, and he prepares. People think that he does it naturally. No, he prepares. He prepares. He works on the lines. He works on the delivery. I've read his biography, which is a fascinating read by Walter Isaacson, Steve Jobs. Fabulous read. And you watch him speak and you see his delivery. And you also see him when he's not totally I've also seen him when he's not totally prepared. So there's a interesting video of him speaking to Cupertino City Council about getting some expansion approved. And there's a point where one of the counselors starts to question him. And typical politician counselor starts off by flattering him. And Steve Jobs knows what's coming, and he even comments, says, "Here he comes." Steve even stands back, picks up the stool he's standing on, and holds it in front of him as if he's holding him up. So Steve makes humor of the moment, takes the edge off.
Pretty awesome.
And he then addresses the question, and he does it in a calm way. He doesn't attack, didn't insult the person like many politicians do. He just answered the question and said how this would benefit not only the people at Apple, but also Cupertino. So Steve is a terrific speaker to learn from. Now, one of Steve Jobs' interesting presentation was his commencement speech at Stanford, which he attended but didn't graduate from. And he delivered, and many people spoke highly of that speech. And it's interesting. When I watched that speech, it is a fantastically well-written speech. When he delivers that speech, he read every word, even when he's telling his own life story, which tells me that he's uncomfortable. And when I watched him, I could see pain in him. Really? And I believe that that's the time that he was having his health problems, whether he didn't know if he was going to live or not.
Yeah.
But watch that, and even his voice, he's a man in pain at that point. and compare that to when he's talking about the iPhone or the iPad or introducing those products. Different man.
Perseus was given tools and instructions by the gods about exactly how to destroy the Medusa. And he improvised a little bit, as you mentioned, by looking in the mirror so he didn't have to look directly at Medusa's eyes and therefore turn to stone himself. But what you're talking about with regards to Steve Jobs also reminds me, you don't necessarily need to follow everything to a T. You need to practice. You need to make sure that you listen to your coaches and your mentors, but you can't just expect things to go perfectly. Now, an easy way to avoid that, but that ultimately causes disaster, and sometimes people to even walk out of a speech, is exactly what Steve, it sounds like, was forced to do due to his illness, which is literally read off a paper. But then other times, the lack of preparation shows in terms of just coming across as uninspired or screwing up badly in the middle of your presentation. And that can happen even if you are extraordinarily well prepared. As we move to a conclusion in this conversation, what thoughts do you have for people who, again, might view themselves as advanced speakers, but really haven't mastered handling the mid-presentation goof, especially if it's a big one?
The first point is you're going to goof up. And it's not a matter of avoiding it. You do everything you can to avoid, and life happens. Things go wrong. I've seen 2 presentations where the fire alarm went off during the speech.
Oh my.
And
wow,
it happened to me one time as well. And even though I had seen it happen twice before, I remember when it happened to me, my first thought was selfish. It was about me. It was, why me? How could this happen to me? Yeah. And then I thought, wait a minute, I've seen this before, George. You've seen this before. Okay. And yeah, the fire alarm went off and there was smoke coming from the kitchen. We were in a restaurant area. And so I told people, I think we should move out of this room just in case and see if there's a real danger. And it cut off my speech. And then later I gave a much shorter version of the end of the speech. My point is always be willing to change, to adapt. Be willing to, you're not there to say everything that you intend to say. If you've got something important to say it early. Don't keep it to the end, because the fire alarm might go off. The microphone might break down. Someone in your audience might have a heart attack. There's going to be noise from the next room. There's the windows open and there's a fire alarm. There's a fire truck going by. Those things will go wrong, and people will judge you more by how you handle the disruption, how you get back on track, than your speech. And they'll remember. In fact, people remembered. I spoke at that same organization a year later, and they were still talking about the fire alarm.
Wow. I also have to say, so I did 2 TEDx's earlier this year. The first one was in a theater that was in an older building. And for those who don't know, for TEDx, you really have to memorize your speech. I mean, theoretically, you can just go up there and extemporaneously talk off the top of your head, but it's being recorded. It's going to be uploaded onto YouTube. So do that at your own risk. And in addition, if your speech doesn't meet TED standards, they won't upload it at all. So really do it at your own risk. I had rehearsed this first speech for months, and I had rehearsed it understanding that what we were told was going to be the reality, which is that there would be a lavalier mic that we would use. And so I memorized the words tied to hand and body gestures. Well, this, like I said, was an older building. There were so many people with their phones there in the audience that it couldn't handle the Wi-Fi. And so the lavaliers went down about 3/4 of the way through the event, and I was the last speaker of the day. And so initially they came up and they said, do you want a stand-up mic or do you want a handheld mic? And I said, I really would like a stand-up mic, please. But it turns out that TED does not allow that. In fact, TED was very vehement. So they grabbed a handheld mic, and then that handheld mic that I was using lost its power. And all of this was right before I was about to go on. And the handheld mic kind of was a big deal, because if I had memorized everything according to hand motions and one of my hands was totally occupied with the mic, and I had never done a lot of the things that you normally would do, like measure how loud you sound and how close you want to be, all that, it was totally off the cuff. I personally wasn't worried about being too soft due to the mic going away. That's not my issue. There are other issues I have, but that wasn't one. But nonetheless, memorizing or reciting what I had memorized was suddenly a critical thing. And there were a wide range of reactions to this. I'll just say that. And I really felt that that was something that I was proud of, was that I wasn't one of those people. I think a few years before, I might have gone into a diva mode and gotten angry and all temper tantrum. What does it serve? What does it serve? We can't control the fire alarms. We can't control any of this stuff. So yeah, going into poor me, it's a waste of time. And that's the one thing I realized there. There has been so much that you have shared, George. I want to make sure that you have a lot to say here at the end. But before we get to that, if there is a single takeaway that I pull from everything that you've said, it's this idea that kind of has come up over and over again, that it can't be just all about me. Public presentation, public speaking, delivering a message in a way that's captivating is a core and absolutely essential leadership skill. But in leadership situations, too many people turn that into an excuse to indulge their most narcissistic tendencies. That undermines then this core leadership skill, and the connection between the two I never quite put together as finely as your words, stories, and advice were able to pull out. So I thank you for that. George, if there is a last word that you would like to share with the audience, or something that you want to say that you didn't have a chance to so far, what might that be?
Interesting that you mentioned the point of arrogance. One of my clients had successfully built a $50 million business, but he started losing deals at the presentation stage. He called me in to help him out, and I discovered he already was a good speaker. The problem was his arrogance was showing. And so we created his presentation from scratch, and I got him to talk more about the audience and to dissipate the arrogance. And after that, he started winning his next deal, which was a $10 million deal. But his arrogance got in the way, especially when you're trying to ask someone for $10 million. If they don't like you, they think that you are putting yourself on a pedestal, they're not going to give you that money. It doesn't matter how good your service is. So yes, there is a point where arrogance, so it is a point about being confident, but not letting it go to your head. Your confidence is this: I've got this. I've got this. I can do this.
What a way to end a great discussion. George, how can people find out more about you? Where should they go? And what do you have going on in your life?
The simplest place where people can find me is to get weekly tips from me. Go to the website, toroktips.com. toroktips.com. You can sign up for weekly tips from me. And when you first sign up, you also receive a package of additional tips on speaking virtually, tips on mistakes to avoid. So that's the simplest and easiest place to find me.
I have been a longtime subscriber to your newsletter. I look forward to it every time it comes out, and so I have to heartily endorse that. For those of you who have enjoyed today's episode, be sure to come back again. Also, make a point of subscribing to this channel so you can be the very first to hear about new episodes when they come out. And be sure to share everything that you can about this channel and its contents, including episodes like this one with George Torok, with everyone that you care about who you think could benefit from it. Furthermore, make sure that you follow me on the other social channels that are out there. They are located in the caption below. And most of all, I love hanging out here at the Myth-Slayer Cafe, but that's because you, my audience, are here and you make it special. See you next time at the Myth-Slayer Cafe.